All right, we're going to go ahead and get started here. This will be a Civil War Causes PowerPoint, and you need to type in as I go along. Going to move quickly, so just follow along with me. All right, first we are going to discuss the differing viewpoints on the balance of federal and state power, early political parties, and early actions like the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions and how they helped divide the nation. From the beginning, Americans were divided over whether to support the new Constitution and a strong national or federal government. Federalists, and this is right where you first type in, you want to put in the North, they favored ratification. Anti-Federalists were from the South, they were against ratification. Ratification being approving of this brand new Constitution. So remember, this is a Civil War PowerPoint. We're starting right from the beginning. These are the causes that are going to lead up to the Civil War. James Madison was a leading Federalist. Madison and others argued that a strong national government was needed for the Union to survive. Federalists held a, you want to type in loose, view of how to read the Constitution. Loose meaning what is necessary and proper. Could the government, the federal government that is, create a law that's necessary and proper? That was a loose view. This was problematic with many leaders in many states. At that time, the national government could not even enforce its own laws. Remember, this is part of the Articles of Confederation. This is why we wrote a new Constitution. The Articles were just weak and ineffective. Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay explained their support for the Constitution in a series of newspaper articles that drew wide attention. Again, these were called the Federalist Papers. So, after the Constitution was written, September 17, 1787, the states had 1 year to ratify the Constitution, and the Federalist Papers were written to encourage the states to do just that, to support this brand new Constitution. George Mason and Patrick Henry were among anti-Federalist leaders who argued that the new national government would have too much power. They believed that it would weaken the states, there was no Bill of Rights, and a president could become king. Anti-Federalists held a strict view of how to read the Constitution. They felt that which was necessary and proper should tie back to what was currently written word for word in the Constitution. By the 1790s, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton were quarreling and growing apart. You might say the Civil War started here. Jefferson was Secretary of the State. He represented the United States to foreign nations. His party was mainly in the South, whereas Hamilton was Secretary of the Treasury, which was mainly in the North. The Republicans in the South, this was the Democratic Republicans, later shortened to Republicans, wanted to keep most power at the state or local level. They favored states' rights. They feared that a strong central government would act like a monarchy. Again, they favored more power to the states. The Federalists in the North said that the United States needed a strong federal government. They believed that the federal government would hold the country together and deal with its problems. So they favored a stronger federal government with a loose interpretation, capable of handling problems on the go. The two parties also had geographic differences. Federalists were strong among northern merchants. Republicans were supported by southern farmers. So you had a definite manufacturing versus an agricultural vision with these two particular parties. Federalists and Republicans disagreed about many issues. These are some of the main ones. Republicans in the South were led by Jefferson. They believed people should have political power. They favored strong state government. They emphasized agriculture, favored a strict interpretation of the Constitution, pro-French, opposed a national bank, and opposed protective tariffs. Tariffs were taxes on imported goods. The Federalists in the North were led by Hamilton. They believed the wealthy and educated should lead. They favored strong central government. They emphasized manufacturing, shipping, and trade, a loose interpretation of the Constitution. They were pro-British, favored a national bank, and favored protective tariffs. This was to help the manufacturing base that was very large in the North. Federal versus state power. Arguments for states' rights in the South felt that the federal government derives its power from rights given to it by the states. Because the states created the U.S., individual states can cancel or nullify a federal law. Arguments for federal power in the North. The federal government derives its power from rights given to it by the American people. States have no power to nullify or cancel federal laws, and states cannot revoke federal power set forth in the Constitution. Remember, this is not 1860, a year from the Civil War. This is upon the founding of our Constitution, the founding of our federal government. These were arguments that started decades before the Civil War. The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions were far more important than the laws that provoked them. They claimed that states could nullify, that means cancel, a law passed by Congress. Federalists found the concept of states' rights to be threatening to the new nation. The resolutions also boosted the idea of states' rights. So again, the South favored these Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. The North did not. All right, switching gears here. We'll talk about the Bank of the U.S., why tariffs weren't well received in the South, South Carolina threatening to secede, and nullification. The new government was not collecting enough money to repay its debt. It needed new sources of income. You can see by the chart there that we owed a whole lot of money, way more than we were taking in. This was problematic. We had to pay off our debt. The Secretary of the Treasury, this is Hamilton. Again, Hamilton is in the North. Developed a plan to solve the financial crisis. He stated that the federal government would pay off all federal and state debts. The federal government would create a national bank. And the federal government would impose a high tax on imported goods. Many Southerners opposed Hamilton's plan for the government to repay state debts. Southerners thought each state should repay its own debts. Again, this was part of states' rights. Hamilton believed his plan would encourage future investors. Southerners supported Hamilton after Congress agreed to build the new capital city in the South. And this, of course, is Washington, D.C. In 1791, Congress created the National Bank. Americans disagreed over whether the Constitution gave government this particular power. Southerners, or supporters in the North, pointed out that the Constitution gave Congress the power to make all laws necessary and proper for fulfilling its duties. Opponents in the South believed a national bank was unconstitutional because it was not specifically addressed in the Constitution. So again, we're arguing over a strict or loose view on how to read the Constitution. The bank had a 20-year charter. That means authorized permissive role. After the War of 1812, a second national bank now appears. It caused the same problems as before in regard to the North and the South. All right, how did old issues take a new shape in the conflict over a national bank and tariff? The Second Bank of the U.S. earned strong support from business people. This was in the North. Again, this second bank, again, like the first, made loans to businesses. It kept government money safe, issued a stable currency, and then finally created confidence in U.S. banks. However, many Americans disliked the bank because it restricted loans made by state banks. This angered farmers and merchants who wanted to borrow money to buy land. And again, some blame the bank for the 1819 financial crisis when many people lost their farms. Since the nation's founding, Americans had debated over the balance of power between the states and the federal government. This is the main issue. The Constitution gave the federal government many significant powers. The 10th Amendment, you want to write in reserved rights for the states and people. So again, this is a balance. How much federal power, how much state power? Again, people disagreed, especially if something was not expressed word for word in the Constitution, like a national bank. Another problem the U.S. faced after the War of 1812 was foreign competition. We wanted our economy strong and not weak. Again, could tariffs help? Before the war, you had the Embargo Act by Thomas Jefferson. This kept British goods out of the U.S. This helped American industry to grow rapidly. After the war, British manufacturers looked to sell their goods in the U.S. This caused the American economy to suffer. So in addition to securing our money, making it stable, we had to deal with threats from foreign countries. This led to the War of 1812. We're trying to come up with solutions so as not to go to war. Again, the British began dumping their goods into the American market. Britain produced goods more cheaply than did the U.S. Many New England businesses failed. Again, most of these businesses, like I said, are in the North. Jefferson, he's a Democratic Republican president. He reads the Constitution strictly. So this is causing tension in the manufacturing North. Factory owners asked Congress for protection. Again, this was hurting their business in the North. Congress responded with the Tariff of 1816, which put a tax on many foreign products. Tariffs helped northern factories compete. Many northerners supported tariffs. Tariffs forced southerners to pay more for goods. Thus, most southerners opposed high tariffs. Remember, the South, going back to colonial America, had done most of their trading with England and Europe. You would think they might have traded more with the North, but most of their trade was overseas. So when tariffs were applied, this was creating goods to be taxed more heavily in the South because the Southerners bought their goods from Europe. This was problematic. Another way to put it would be the South felt they weren't being treated fairly. By increasing the cost of imported goods, tariffs helped U.S. manufacturers compete with foreign manufacturers. But the higher prices hurt consumers. Again, you could see that Britain could very well make things cheaper. However, when a tariff was applied, again, this is at the end here, and I'm circling it, again, a tariff would lower the overall price of the American-made product. This was to spur American industry. The North thought high tariffs would benefit the entire country. Again, in the North, this would bring wealth for manufacturers. In the South and West, northern manufacturers could afford to buy their own farm products. Government would use revenue to improve infrastructure, such as roads, bridges, etc. So this was a northern mindset. In 1828, the debate over states' rights reached a crisis level. Congress passed a law raising tariffs on iron, textiles, and other products. Manufacturers in the North and some parts of the West supported the law. Southerners felt the law was unfair. It made them pay more for goods. Generally, the South would never be in favor of tariffs. Vice President John C. Calhoun agreed with the Southerners. He argued that the states had the right of nullification. The right of nullification. So here we go again, the right to cancel a federal law. For time's sake, we'll go ahead and skip this video. All right, some arguments for nullification. America was formed from an agreement between states. So those that felt that a state could cancel a law, they felt that there was an agreement between states. States kept certain powers, and states had the power to nullify unjust laws. Arguments against nullification. America was formed by the entire American people. You want to type in people. Daniel Webster argued, we are all agents of the same supreme power, the people. All right, moving on to our next topic. How were African Americans viewed in the North and the South? Explain the significance of cotton and the cotton gin to the South. African Americans in the North faced, you want to type in discrimination. Slavery had largely ended in the North by the early 1800s, but free African Americans did not receive the same treatment as whites. Discrimination in the North, suffrage, which would be voting. African Americans were often denied the right to vote. African Americans were not allowed to work in factories or skilled trades. Many employers preferred to hire whites. Schools, public facilities, churches were segregated, so African Americans formed their own churches. And the media. White newspapers often portrayed African Americans as inferior, so African Americans started their own newspapers. How did the cotton affect the social and economic life of the South? A boom in textiles caused by the Industrial Revolution created a huge demand, you want to type in, for cotton. So again, cotton. This was in high demand because of the booming textile or clothing industry. The South's economy became dependent on cotton, and cotton plantations became dependent on slave, you want to type in labor. Dependent on slave labor. In the North, the Industrial Revolution caused industry, immigration, and cities to grow. The South remained largely rural, as its plantations grew wealthy from the cotton trade. Again, the South did not change even from colonial times. There wasn't a whole lot of progression virtually in any area. Before the introduction of the cotton gin, this is short for cotton engine, laborers had to pick seeds out of the cotton by hand, which was a very slow process. In 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. The cotton gin. The cotton gin greatly sped up the processing of cotton and made it much more profitable. In 1790, you want to type in planters, grew 1.5 million pounds of cotton, but by 1820 they grew 10 times as much. You could see by the chart that through the decades, the amount of cotton production is greatly increasing. Cotton became the greatest source of wealth for the United States. And this great wealth enriched northern bankers and ship owners, southern planters. To keep up with the demand for cotton and the new ability to process it quickly, planters used more slave labor. From 1790 to 1860, the price of a slave increased 10 or 20 times. You could see by the chart there that through the decades, slavery greatly increased in the South to meet the demand for cotton. Enslaved African Americans had no rights at all, and their lives were controlled by slave codes. You want to type in codes. These were strict laws governing slaves. The lives of enslaved African Americans in the South. Some enslaved African Americans worked in their owners' homes. Most did heavy farm labor. Some slaveholders worked slaves almost to death and whipped them as punishment for many offenses. Most owners saw their slaves as valuable property. Want to type in property and try to keep them healthy so they would be productive. Owners often broke apart slave families by selling family members. Many enslaved African Americans resisted slaveholders by working slowly, breaking equipment, fleeing to freedom in the North, and rebelling. In 1831, Nat Turner said he was told by God to kill whites in a vision. He led a famous but doomed slave, you want to type in, revolt. Whites retaliated by killing many innocent African Americans. So remember, this is a PowerPoint on the causes of the Civil War. Whether we're talking about political parties early on with Jefferson and Hamilton, whether we're talking about the National Bank, tariffs, or incidences like Nat Turner's revolt this is all leading up to the country splitting apart. After 1808, it was illegal to import enslaved Africans to the United States. This was a compromise in the Constitution. By the 1830s, some Northerners were pushing for slavery, and you want to type in to be banned. So this is where we begin to see some Northerners, not all, but were pushing for slavery to be banned. Supporters of slavery said that it was more humane than the free labor system of the North. I'm going to type in labor. Critics of slavery said that slaves suffered abuse from white owners. Many Southern whites accepted the slave system of slavery, fearing violent uprisings. You want to type in uprisings would follow it if control over slaves was weakened. So again, the South was fearing that with more slave revolts, this would just create more violence. And you could see by looking at the chart, population in thousands, you could see the difference of white and enslaved population. About 6% of the 4 million African Americans in the South were free. Many of the free African Americans made valuable, you want to type in contributions to Southern life. Norbert Rillalux improved sugar refining. Henry Blair invented a seed planting device. So again, there were many contributions that were made by African Americans. Obstacles faced by free African Americans in the South. Free African Americans were given only the most menial jobs. They were discouraged from traveling. Their children could not attend public, you want to type in schools. They could not vote, serve on juries, or testify against white defendants in court. And slave catchers often kidnapped them and sold them into slavery. In the Southern, you want to type in Cotton Kingdom, society was dominated by a small group of wealthy plantation owners. But more than half of all Southern farmers did not have slaves. Instead of growing cotton, these people often grew corn and raised hogs and chickens. So again, not everybody in the South had slaves. That would have been very expensive. Again, most people, what you would call, they were tenant farmers. They worked a small piece of land for somebody else. Some of the differences between the Southern states. In Alabama, Mississippi, and like states, states that depended heavily on cotton had large populations of enslaved people. So you want to type in people. And then states that grew less cotton, such as Kentucky and like states, had smaller populations of enslaved people. All right, at this point, we're going to end part 1 of Civil War causes. We'll come back shortly and we'll cover part 2.